The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft as old cloth, and Grace Talmadge had memorized every word on it long before she ever boarded the westbound train in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 1882. She sat in the hard wooden seat of the passenger car with the letter pressed flat against her knee, watching the land change outside the window the way a person watches a familiar face age. Ohio had been green and soft, Indiana flat and forgettable, Illinois wide and gray, and then Missouri had opened up like a door into another world entirely. The sky grew bigger. The trees grew thinner and farther apart. The towns grew fewer, their names rougher sounding on the tongue, as if the very language was hardening to match the terrain. And somewhere past Kansas City, the last of the soft green world fell away entirely, and Grace felt the west take hold of her like a hand closing around a stone. She was 24 years old and had no business being on that train. That was what her aunt had told her, standing on the platform in Cincinnati with her arms crossed and her lips pressed together like a woman who has already said too much. Grace had listened to every word of it with her traveling bag in her hand, and her mind already 1,000 miles gone. Her aunt was not a cruel woman. She simply could not understand why a schoolteacher with a steady position and a modest but livable income would throw all of it away to chase a promise made to a woman who was already dead. But Grace understood. She had understood from the moment she sat beside Nora Conroy's bed in the charity ward of St. Michael's Hospital and held that thin, papery hand while the older woman struggled to find enough breath for words. Nora Conroy had come east to die. That was the blunt truth of it, though she had framed it differently at first, telling the ladies of the Cincinnati Church Society that she had come to visit family, to rest, to see the city one more time before she got too old for the journey. The ladies of the Church Society had believed her because they wanted to. Grace had not believed her from the start, because Grace had a habit of seeing people clearly, even when it cost her something. She had met Nora at a church supper in February of 1882, just 4 months before this train ride, and something about the older woman had drawn her attention immediately. Nora was perhaps 60, small and brown as a walnut, with the kind of stillness around her that Grace associated with people who had long ago stopped being surprised by the world. She had silver hair pinned back severely and dark eyes that were still sharp despite the pallor of illness already visible beneath her skin. She walked slowly but with great deliberateness, as if each step was a decision she had made in advance and was committed to fully. Grace had brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her, and they had talked until every other person in the room had gone home and the candles were burning low. Nora spoke of a place called Redemption, Texas, which Grace had never heard of, a small ranching town on the edge of the caprock country south of Amarillo, still rough and barely organized in those years when the cattle drives were still the lifeblood of that part of the world. She spoke of a ranch called the Conroy Place, which she had built with her hands and her late husband's hands over 30 years of brutal work. And she spoke of her son. His name was Tobias. He was 26 years old. He ran the ranch alone now because there was no one else to run it, and he worked from before sunrise to after dark every day of his life, and he was good, Nora said. He was genuinely good, the way only a person who has been tested and not broken can be good. But he was also alone in a way that frightened her, alone in the way of a man who has closed some door inside himself and forgotten that he did it. She had asked Grace something that night that no one had ever asked her before. She had looked at her with those dark, still eyes and said, very simply, "Will you go to him? Not to marry him, I am not asking that. I am asking you to go to Redemption and make sure he is all right. Make sure he has not disappeared into that land out there. Make sure someone sees him." Grace had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had asked why her. Nora had smiled, and it was a smile with a great deal of tiredness in it and also a great deal of sincerity. "Because you see people," she said. "I watched you tonight. You see people the way most folks see through them, and my boy needs to be seen." 3 weeks later, Nora Conroy was in St. Michael's Charity Ward, and Grace was sitting beside her every evening after school, and the two of them had become something that Grace could not name precisely, but that felt like the closest thing to a kindred spirit she had ever found. When Nora died on a cold Tuesday in March, quiet and without drama, the way she had apparently done everything in her life, Grace had been holding her hand. And she had made the promise then, not because anyone forced her to, but because it had been Nora's last request, and because something in Grace had already decided before she was fully conscious of deciding. She would go west. She would find Tobias Conroy. She would make sure he was seen. The train stopped in Amarillo in the yellow afternoon light of a Thursday in late May, and Grace stepped down onto the platform with her traveling bag and her trunk, and stood for a moment simply absorbing the fact of the place. Amarillo in 1882 was not yet the city it would eventually become. It was a railroad town, young and raw, its streets more dirt than plan, its buildings the particular combination of permanence and impermanence that characterized every place the railroad had recently touched. The air smelled of livestock and dust, and something Grace could not identify that she would later learn was simply the smell of the Texas Panhandle itself, a clean, dry, ancient smell that had no equivalent anywhere east of the 100th meridian. She had a name written in her notebook alongside the letter from Nora, Redemption, Texas, 40 miles south and slightly west of Amarillo. The letter also contained the name of the general store in Redemption, a man named Henderson who was apparently a reliable source of local information, and a brief description of the Conroy Ranch, which sat about 8 miles east of the town itself at the end of a road that was not exactly a road, but that you could follow if you knew what to look for. Getting from Amarillo to Redemption required a stagecoach, and the stagecoach ran twice a week, and Grace had just missed it by 2 days. The man at the livery stable told her this without any particular sympathy, the way people in the West seemed to deliver bad news, as straightforward as weather, as if softening it would only be confusing. She could wait 2 days for the next run, or she could hire a horse and ride it herself, or she could try her luck with one of the freight wagons heading that direction. Grace Talmadge had not ridden a horse in 6 years. She had ridden them in childhood, competently if not elegantly, on the farm outside Cincinnati where she had grown up before her parents passed and her aunt took her in. The memory of it came back to her with unexpected vividness as she stood in the livery stable looking at the available animals. The particular cooperation of it, the conversation between your body and the animal's body, the negotiation of trust carried on without words. She told the livery man she would hire a horse. He looked at her the way several men in Amarillo had already looked at her, with a kind of baffled assessment, as if she were a species they had encountered before but were not entirely sure what to do with. She was tall for a woman of that era, with brown hair that she kept pinned back severely and gray eyes that had a directness to them that some people found unsettling. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that was practical rather than ornamental and boots that had seen real use. She did not look like a woman playing at something. She looked like a woman who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. She set out south from Amarillo the following morning with her traveling bag strapped behind the saddle and Nora's letter in her coat pocket, and a small but reasonably detailed map that the man at the general store in Amarillo had drawn for her on the back of a paper bag. The ride took most of the day. The land was extraordinary. She had not expected that, had not expected to find beauty in what she had imagined would be a purely harsh and unglamorous landscape. But the caprock country had a grandeur to it that moved her in ways she struggled to articulate even in the long letters she would write later. The sky was enormous, a pure and violent blue that made the sky she had known in Ohio seem like something seen through gauze. The grass, still winter pale in places, moving in long waves with every shift of the wind, gave the land the quality of a living thing, breathing in and out with slow regularity. There were hawks. There were the white geometry of cattle bones half buried in dry creek beds. There were wildflowers she could not name coming up in cracks in the caliche soil, small and tenacious and impossibly bright. She reached the outskirts of Redemption by mid-afternoon, a cluster of buildings around a central unpaved street, and she felt the eyes of the town on her before she had fully cleared the last rise. A woman traveling alone on horseback was not, in Redemption, Texas, in 1882, a common sight, and the town registered her arrival with the collective attention of a place that has very little entertainment and makes the most of what it gets. She found Henderson's general store without difficulty, tied her horse at the post, and went inside. Henderson himself was behind the counter, a broad man in his 50s with a wide gray mustache and the careful, measuring eyes of a man who has spent decades taking the measure of strangers. He looked at her bag, looked at the horse through the window, and then looked back at her with what she would later recognize as his habitual expression. Polite, non-committal, and deeply curious. She told him her name and told him she was looking for the Conroy Ranch. She told him that she had known Nora Conroy in Cincinnati. Something shifted in Henderson's face at the name. Not grief exactly, but the kind of quiet recognition that passes over a person's features when they hear the name of someone they had cared about in a time that is gone. He had heard that Nora had passed, he told her. Word had come west with the mail back in March. He had told Tobias himself, or tried to. The boy, he said, and then caught himself and said the man, had taken it hard, which in Redemption meant he had not come into town for 6 weeks and had apparently spent that time alone on the ranch doing the kind of work that is really a form of not thinking. Grace listened to all of this carefully. She asked how Tobias was now, and Henderson said he didn't rightly know, that Tobias came in for supplies every week or two, was quiet but polite, did not appear to be in any immediate crisis, but that there was something about him lately that Henderson could not put a name to. Like a lamp, he said, that was still burning but had run low on oil. You could see the light, but you could see how thin it had gotten. She thanked him and asked about a place to stay the night. He directed her to a woman named Mrs. Patricia Hollies, who kept a clean room in her house 2 streets over and who charged reasonable rates and did not ask too many questions, which Henderson said with the slight emphasis of a man who was himself asking several questions in his mind and was choosing not to voice them. Mrs. Hollies turned out to be a bright-eyed woman of about 50 with 3 cats and strong opinions about the railroad and very good coffee, and Grace liked her immediately. She stayed one night, ate a hot meal, slept in a genuine bed for the first time since Cincinnati, and rose before dawn feeling the particular clarity of a person who has committed to a course of action and is now simply in the process of completing it. She asked Mrs. Hollies about the road to the Conroy Ranch. Mrs. Hollies gave her the directions with the easy familiarity of a woman who has known that road for decades, and then she paused and looked at Grace with an expression that combined warmth and frank curiosity. She asked if Grace was a relative of Nora's. Grace said no, and that she would explain later when there was more time, and Mrs. Hollies nodded the way a woman nods when she has accepted that full information is not immediately available, but has also made a private note to get it eventually. The road to the Conroy Ranch was, as Nora's letter had warned, more suggestion than certainty. It was 8 miles of grassland and low scrub and dry creek crossings, marked by the ruts of a wagon and the occasional fence post, and it required attention and a certain willingness to trust that the trail knew where it was going even when you were not entirely sure. Grace rode it in the early morning cool, the sun low behind her throwing her shadow long and thin across the grass, and she thought about what she was going to say to a man she had never met, a man whose mother had asked a stranger to come and see him. She still did not know what she would say. She had been thinking about it since Cincinnati, and she had not arrived at anything satisfactory. You could not walk up to a man and tell him his dead mother sent you. You could not pretend to be something you were not, because Nora had said he was perceptive, that he read people the way Grace did, and a lie would unravel in minutes. She had finally decided, somewhere on the train through Missouri, that she would simply tell the truth and let the truth be whatever it was going to be. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. The particular smell of cattle and horses and worked leather and wood smoke that is the specific signature of a working ranch in the Texas Panhandle, carried on the morning wind across the grass. Then she came over a low rise, and there it was below her, a main house of weathered lumber, gray-brown as old bone, with a covered porch running the length of the front. A barn large enough to suggest the operation had once been more extensive than it currently was. A corral with 3 horses standing in the early light, and a windmill turning slowly against the brightening sky, its creak just audible at this distance. And there was a man. He was working at the corral fence, replacing a section of rail that had apparently come loose, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who has done this task many times. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a battered hat and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the morning chill. He had not yet seen her. She watched him work for a moment, this son of the woman who had asked her to come, and she felt the strangeness of the situation settle over her fully for the first time. She was here. She had actually done it. She had come 2,000 miles on a promise made to a dead woman, and there was the son that woman had raised, and she was going to have to ride down that rise and introduce herself and explain why she was here. She rode down. He heard the horse before he saw her and turned without alarm, the easy wariness of a man accustomed to being on his own land but not opposed to visitors. He shaded his eyes with one hand against the rising sun. When she was close enough, she saw his face clearly for the first time, and she filed it away with the automatic precision of someone who has spent years reading faces. He was about 26, as Nora had said, with a strong-boned face that was weathered and brown, and had the particular quality of a face that has spent a lot of time outdoors in all weathers. He had dark eyes, dark as Nora's had been but with a different energy in them, less the stillness of age and acceptance and more something she could not immediately name. His jaw was set. His expression was polite but guarded, the expression of a man who has learned to hold himself somewhat apart. He said good morning in a voice that was quieter than she had expected from someone his size, and asked if he could help her. She stopped her horse and looked down at him for a moment, and then she took a breath and said, "My name is Grace Talmadge. I was with your mother when she passed, Mr. Conroy, and I came because she asked me to." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a statement that has landed in a man's center of gravity. He stood very still. His hand dropped from where it had been shading his eyes. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between pain and a very controlled kind of shock, and then he said, very quietly, "You'd better come inside." She tied her horse at the post near the corral and followed him up the porch steps and into the house, and she entered the life of Tobias Conroy. The inside of the house was spare and clean in the way of a place kept by someone who lives alone and has decided that order is a form of control over a world that offers precious little of it. There was a kitchen and a main room with a stone fireplace, and the furniture was plain and solid, made for use rather than appearance. There were books on a shelf, more than she would have expected, and a woman's rocker near the window that had a slightly different character than the other furniture, as if it had come from somewhere else and had not quite settled into belonging here. She understood, without being told, that the rocker had been Nora's. He put coffee on without asking whether she wanted it, which she appreciated. She sat at the kitchen table and he stood with his back to her for a moment at the stove, and she could see, in the set of his shoulders, the work he was doing to compose himself. When he sat across from her with 2 cups of coffee between them, she told him everything. She told him about the church supper, about the conversations in the long Cincinnati evenings, about the weeks at the hospital. She told him what Nora had said about him, not in a way designed to flatter, but in a way designed to be accurate, because accuracy was the only real kindness she knew how to offer. She told him that his mother had loved him with a completeness that was not contingent on anything he did or failed to do, and she told him about the promise she had made and why she had kept it. He listened to all of it without interrupting. His coffee sat untouched and cooling before him. When she finished, there was a long quiet. Outside, the windmill kept turning. One of the horses in the corral called out and was answered by another. He said, "She never told me she was sick." Grace said she knew. He said, "She went east because she wanted to die somewhere that wasn't here, because she didn't want me to watch it." Grace said she thought that was probably right. He was quiet again, and then he said something that she would think about for a very long time afterward. He said, "She would have liked you." And it came out not as a polite thing to say, but as a plain observation, the kind a person makes when they have looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion. She stayed for lunch. She had not planned to stay for lunch, but Tobias Conroy apparently had strong opinions about feeding people who had traveled a significant distance, and he made a simple meal of salt pork and cornbread with a quiet competence that suggested cooking was, for him, another form of the practical problem-solving he applied to everything. They talked while he cooked, cautiously at first, finding the shape of each other, and Grace was struck by the quality of his listening. He listened the way very few people listened, with his full attention, not preparing his next statement while she was still making hers. She told him about Cincinnati. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle market and the dry years, and the fence disputes with a neighboring operation to the North Run, by a man named Aldridge who seemed to believe that property lines were suggestions rather than facts. He told her about the town of Redemption, about Henderson's store and the church that had no minister half the time and the schoolhouse that had no teacher at all since the last one had left 6 months ago to get married in Abilene. That last detail landed in the room with a significance that neither of them immediately acknowledged. After lunch, he walked her back to her horse, and they stood in the afternoon sun with the wind moving through the grass all around them, and she asked whether she might come back. She had framed it in practical terms, had said she wanted to continue talking, that there were things about his mother she had not yet told him, which was true. But they both knew, or at least she knew and suspected he knew, that the real reason was simpler and less easily explained. He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes, and then he said yes, with a brevity that she recognized as not curtness but simple directness, and she rode back toward Redemption with the late sun in her eyes and a feeling in her chest that she had not felt in a long time and was not yet ready to name. She took the room at Mrs. Hollis's house on a weekly basis. Mrs. Hollis asked no questions, as promised, though her eyes asked several whenever Grace came back from the Conroy ranch with color in her cheeks and a certain altered quality in her expression, a loosening of something that had been held tightly. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Grace had not anticipated, but that felt, almost immediately, like the most natural thing in the world. She rode out to the ranch every other day, sometimes every day. Tobias did not change the way he worked. He was up before dawn and working until dark, and she fell into the rhythm of it with a readiness that surprised her. She was not, she discovered, a woman who was content to watch. She helped where she could, with the kitchen garden that had gone somewhat to neglect, with the mending pile that had accumulated into a small mountain on the chair near the fireplace, and with the horses, whom she understood and who understood her with the immediate recognition of animals for people who are genuinely fond of them. They talked constantly. This was the thing she had not expected, the enormous amount they had to say to each other. She had expected politeness, had expected a gradual warming, had expected the careful progression of two people who are cautious and private by nature. What she had not expected was the way the conversation between them seemed to begin mid-sentence, as if they had been talking all along and had only been separated by geography, as if the 2,000 miles between Cincinnati and this corner of the Texas Panhandle had been a parenthesis rather than a gap. He told her about growing up on this land, about the particular education it gave you, the way you learn to read weather and animals and soil, the way you learn to be patient because patience was not optional. It was survival. He told her about his father, who had died when Tobias was 16, a slow death from a fever that had arrived one fall and not left until it had taken everything it wanted. He told her about the years after, just him and Nora running the ranch with 2 hired hands who eventually moved on to other work, and how the ranch had slowly contracted from the ambitious thing his father had built toward something smaller but possibly more sustainable, and how he had made peace with that. She told him about the farm where she had grown up, about her parents, about the particular grief of losing both of them within 2 years of each other when she was 12 and 13. She told him about her aunt, who was kind but not warm, and about the school teaching, which she had loved genuinely and was not sure she wanted to give up permanently, though she had taken a leave of absence rather than resigning because she had not been certain what she was going to find when she came west. She told him she had come from a world of books and classrooms and the particular human architecture of a city, and that this land, this enormous open land that had nothing to hide behind, was showing her things about herself she had not previously known. He listened to all of it with that full attention quality and asked questions that were precise and showed he had been paying attention to not just the words but the meaning behind them. About 2 weeks into her stay, there was an evening. She had stayed later than usual because they had spent the afternoon working together to repair the roof of the small storage shed behind the house, which had sustained damage in a spring storm, and the work had taken longer than expected. By the time they finished, the sun was already below the horizon, and the sky was doing the thing the Texas sky did in the evening, which was produce a color show of such extravagance that it seemed almost theatrical, the kind of sunset that would look like an exaggeration if you painted it. They sat on the porch steps to watch it. They were close enough that she was aware of him with a physical specificity that she had been, until that point, successfully managing by not examining it too directly. He was tired in the easy, satisfied way of a person who has done good work, and he had taken his hat off, and his dark hair was damp at the temples, and he was looking at the sky with an expression of such uncomplicated appreciation that something inside her chest did a thing she recognized but had not given permission for. He said, without looking at her, "I didn't know what I was expecting when you showed up that first morning." She said she hadn't been sure what to expect either. He turned then and looked at her directly, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched past the length of ordinary silence into something else, something that had weight and warmth to it, and then a horse made a sound in the corral, and they both looked away, and the moment shifted. But it did not disappear. It settled into the fabric of what they were to each other and stayed there, present and acknowledged in the way of things that are felt before they are spoken. The trouble with Aldridge began the following week. Warren Aldridge owned the Rocking A considerably larger operation than the Conroy Ranch, situated to the north and west. He was the kind of man who had arrived in that part of Texas with money already made elsewhere, and had proceeded to conduct himself on the assumption that money, in the West, could be made to serve the same function as it served in the East, which was to say the function of deciding things in advance of their being decided. He was in his mid-40s, physically imposing in the way of a man who has always been physically imposing and has arranged his personality around it, and he had been conducting a quiet but persistent campaign to acquire the Conroy property for some years, recognizing that the land adjacent to his own creek access was worth considerably more than the asking price Nora had always firmly refused to entertain. Grace became aware of Aldridge gradually, through the particular way Tobias's face changed when his name came up, a tightening around the eyes that was not quite anger but was close to it, the expression of someone dealing with something that requires constant low-level vigilance. She asked about him directly one morning, when she found Tobias repairing a section of fence on the northern boundary that had been knocked down in a way that looked less like weather and more like intentionality. Tobias told her about the fence disputes, the grazing disputes. The time 2 years ago when Aldridge had sent a man to the county land office in Amarillo with what turned out to be a falsified document, attempting to claim a portion of the Conroy water rights. Nora had fought that one personally, had ridden to Amarillo herself at 60 years old, and had produced the original deed and the original survey with the cool authority of a woman who had kept her papers in perfect order for 30 years specifically, because she had always suspected someone would try something like this. Grace felt something harden in her chest when she heard this. She recognized injustice when she saw it, had seen it in Cincinnati too, in different forms, the quiet machinery by which those with resources tried to absorb those without. She asked what the current situation was. Tobias said it was stable for now, but that Aldridge had been making offers again, more aggressively since Nora's death, apparently operating on the assumption that the son would be easier to move than the mother. He said this without self-pity, but with a flatness that told her he was aware of what the assumption implied about how he was perceived, and that he did not appreciate being underestimated. Grace asked if he had a lawyer. He said there wasn't one in Redemption, and the nearest one was in Amarillo, and he had consulted with him once, which had cost money he could not easily spare. She thought about this for several days. She had been corresponding regularly with her aunt and with a few colleagues in Cincinnati, keeping the thread of her Eastern life intact against the possibility of return, but she had not thought very concretely about the future until now. The schoolhouse in Redemption had no teacher. Tobias's land needed legal protection. Both of these were problems she could see clearly and could see paths toward solving, and the fact that she could see those paths with such immediacy told her something about how thoroughly this place had claimed her attention. She went to see Henderson at the general store and told him she was a trained school teacher and asked about the possibility of reopening the school. Henderson looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been handed something he very much wanted and is verifying that it is real. He said that the school board, which consisted of 3 men including himself, had been trying to find a teacher for 6 months and had been unable to attract anyone willing to come to a town this far west for the wages they could offer. Grace named a wage that was slightly below what she had made in Cincinnati but sufficient, and Henderson named a slightly lower wage, and they reached a compromise in about 4 minutes, which Grace thought was a record for negotiations of this kind. She sent a letter to her aunt explaining that she would not be returning to Cincinnati in the fall, and possibly not after that. Her aunt wrote back promptly with a letter that managed to be both genuinely worried and genuinely exasperated in equal measure, and Grace wrote back with the patience of someone who has learned that certain decisions cannot be explained, only lived. She started teaching in June, which was early for the school year, but there were 14 children in Redemption whose education had been effectively suspended for 6 months, and their parents were more than willing to send them to summer sessions. Grace organized the schoolhouse, which was a single room with decent light and a genuine blackboard and a stove that worked, sorted the available textbooks by grade level, and opened her first day of school in Redemption, Texas, on a Monday morning with the professional confidence of someone who has been doing this for years and the slightly different, more alive feeling of someone doing it in a place that matters to them. Tobias came by the schoolhouse that first day at noon to see how it was going, which she suspected he had planned to do casually and present as coincidence, and she did not embarrass him by pointing this out. He stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse during the lunch break looking at the room with an expression that she had learned to read by now, that particular combination of appreciation and something more private, and he said it looked good, that his mother had always wished Redemption had a reliable school. She told him that it was going to have one now. He smiled then, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without the reservation that generally attended his expressions, and it rearranged his face in a way that she found extremely significant and was, again, careful not to examine too directly. July came with heat and clarity, and the particular intimacy that proximity generates. She was at the ranch most evenings now, and on Saturdays when there was no school, she came in the morning and stayed through the day, helping and talking and simply being there in the way of someone who belongs to a place. The space between them had been gradually, steadily, inevitably closing, not in the dramatic way of stories but in the quiet way of reality, which is more incremental and more certain. There was an evening in the first week of July when the heat had been particularly fierce, and they had been working in the late afternoon to repair a water trough near the barn. They were both hot and tired and somewhat covered in the particular grime of physical work outdoors in July in Texas, and Tobias had gone to the pump and filled a bucket and was washing his face and hands, and he turned around and she was right there, closer than she meant to be because she had come to get her own turn at the pump, and they were suddenly very close and looking at each other. He said her name. Just her name, Grace, and she heard in it every conversation they had had and every evening on the porch and every morning of work, and every time one of them had looked at the other a moment too long, and she stepped toward him slightly, just slightly, and he reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that was startling from a man whose hands were accustomed to hard work, and then he stopped and said, "I should tell you something." She waited. He said, "I think about you all the time. I thought about you every day between your visits, and I think about you when you are here, and I am not entirely sure what to do with that, because I did not come to it expecting it, and I am not in the habit of saying things like this." She looked at him for a moment and then she said, with the directness that was her primary and most reliable quality, "I think about you all the time too." He looked at her as if she had confirmed something he had been almost afraid to verify, and then he reached for her hand and held it, simply held it, standing there in the July heat with the windmill turning overhead, and the smell of water and dust and horses around them, and it was one of the most complete moments she had ever experienced. They had dinner together that evening sitting on the porch as the heat finally released its grip on the day, and the conversation between them had a different quality now, warmer and easier, and carrying something new in its undercurrent, the knowledge of what had been said, of what it meant. The matter with Aldridge came to a head in August. Grace had gone to Amarillo on a Friday to collect some school supplies she had ordered through Henderson and to speak with the lawyer there, a man named Hartwell, about the Conroy land situation. She had done this partly on her own initiative and partly because Tobias had, when she suggested it, agreed that it was probably a good idea with the particular mild tone he used when he was grateful for something but was not going to make a production of it. Hartwell turned out to be an intelligent and apparently honest man, which was not guaranteed in any era, and was slightly less guaranteed in the legal practice of the Texas Panhandle in 1882. He had looked over the documents she had brought, the deed, the survey, the water rights filing, and confirmed what she had suspected. Tobias's claim was solid, properly registered, and had no genuine vulnerability to Aldridge's maneuvering. What Aldridge had been doing, Hartwell said with careful professional language, was essentially harassment designed to wear down the owner's resolve, not a genuine legal campaign, because there was no genuine legal claim to be made. He drafted a letter for Hartwell's signature advising Aldridge formally of the legal firmness of the Conroy position and suggesting, with the gentle menace of legal language, that any further interference with the Conroy fences or water access would be pursued through the courts. Grace paid for this out of her own pocket, which she had not mentioned to Tobias in advance and did not intend to draw attention to, because it seemed to her simply the next thing to be done. She came back from Amarillo on a Saturday evening to find that in her absence, 3 of Aldridge's men had ridden through the eastern section of Tobias's range and cut a significant length of fence, allowing about 40 head of Conroy cattle to drift north onto Rockinga land, where they would need to be retrieved through a process that would involve Aldridge's cooperation and would undoubtedly come with conditions. Tobias was controlled in the way of someone who is genuinely angry and is managing it with great effort. He had sent word to Henderson in town and had already gathered 2 neighboring ranchers, good men named Polk and Seintz, who had agreed to ride with him the following morning to collect the cattle. He had also sent a message to the county sheriff in Amarillo, which he expected would produce very little result because the sheriff had a well-known and widely resented tendency to find reasons to be unavailable when the Rocking A was involved in a dispute. Grace sat with him on the porch that night and told him about Hartwell's letter, which had been sent to Aldridge the previous day. She told him what Hartwell had said about the solidity of his claim. Tobias listened carefully, and she watched some of the taut, coiled quality in him ease as the information settled. He said, quietly but with great feeling, that she should not have paid for it. She told him she had wanted to. She told him it was important. He looked at her across the width of the porch, and she saw the difficulty it cost him not to say certain things that he very much wanted to say, and she understood it, because she was experiencing something similar, and they simply sat together in the dark with the stars enormous overhead, the way the stars were out here, present in a way they were never present in the city, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that speaks. The cattle retrieval the following morning went better than expected, largely because Aldridge, having apparently received Hartwell's letter the day before, was in a position of having to be cooperative or be obviously and provably obstructive. He was cooperative, therefore, with the brittle and ungenerous cooperativeness of a man who has been correctly identified and is not pleased about it. The cattle were returned without incident. Polk and Seintz rode home in good spirits. Aldridge sent no further men to cut fences. Henderson said later, with considerable satisfaction, that the Rocking A seemed to have developed a new respect for the Conroy boundary lines, which he attributed to the letter, and to a general community awareness that Tobias Conroy was not as alone in the matter as Aldridge might have calculated. The summer moved on with a sweetness that Grace had not anticipated when she had sat on that hard train seat in May trying to figure out what she was going to say to a man she had never met. She taught her 14 students, who became 17 by August as word spread to neighboring farms. She rode to the ranch. She cooked with Tobias and worked with Tobias and talked with Tobias in the long evenings, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the question of the future, which had been hovering politely in the background, began to press more urgently for attention. She was aware of her own feelings with a clarity she found both illuminating and slightly alarming. She had not come west looking for this. She had come west on a promise, on a debt of the heart, and what she had found was entirely outside the scope of what she had promised to find. She had found Nora's son, as promised, and had found that he was indeed good as promised, but she had also found something that had nothing to do with the promise and everything to do with her own life and what she wanted from it. She thought about this one evening in late August while she was sitting in the kitchen of the ranch house grading papers by lamplight while Tobias read at the table across from her, and she looked up at him, not for the first time, with the particular sensation of someone who is looking at something they are beginning to understand they cannot imagine living without. He looked up at the same moment and caught her looking, and neither of them looked away. He put down his book. He said, "Grace." She said, "Yes." He said, "I need to say something to you, and I am going to say it plainly because I am not very good at saying things indirectly, and I have been going back and forth on whether to say it at all for about 6 weeks." She put down her pencil and waited. He said, "I love you." I understand that this is a great deal to drop in front of a person who came west on a specific errand and may have entirely different ideas about where her life is supposed to go, and I am not asking you for anything tonight. I am just telling you the truth of it because not telling you has become more difficult than telling you. She looked at him across the lamplit table and felt the truth of her own heart with absolute certainty. She said, "I love you too, Tobias. I have loved you for longer than I have been willing to say it plainly." The sound that came from him was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath of relief, but was somewhere between the two, the sound of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has been permitted to set it down. He reached across the table and she took his hand, and they stayed like that for a long while, the papers and the books forgotten, the lamp burning low, the night large and dark and full of stars outside the windows. September arrived, and with it a cooling of the air and a change in the quality of the light, the afternoons going golden and long, the mornings carrying the first real edge of autumn cold. The ranch was in a good position for the year. The cattle were healthy, the water rights were secure, Aldridge had been quiet since the fence incident, and the hay supply was adequate for the coming winter. Grace had 22 students and had sent away to Cincinnati for additional textbooks, and Mrs. Hollies had become something close to a friend, a genuine one rather than simply a convenient landlady. Tobias asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in the third week of September. They had ridden out to the eastern edge of the ranch, to a place she had come to love, a low bluff above a dry creek where the caprock showed through the grass in long shelves of pale stone, and you could see for miles in every direction. He had brought a blanket and cold food and coffee in a pot wrapped in cloth to keep it warm, and they sat on the bluff in the autumn sun for a long while simply talking and looking at the view. Then he turned to her and said, with the same plainness that characterized everything he said that mattered to him, that he wanted her to stay. Not just in redemption, not just at the ranch on visits, but permanently as his wife, as the person who sat across the table from him in the evenings and who would be there in the mornings, as the person this ranch and this life would belong to with him. He said he understood that she had come from a different world, and that there were things about the West that were hard and that were far from what she had known, and he was not asking her to pretend otherwise. He said he could not give her everything her life in Cincinnati had given her, but he said he would do everything in his power to make sure she did not want for anything that he could provide, and that above all, he would see her, the way she had told him once that Nora had seen something in her that was rare, and that he intended to keep seeing her as long as she allowed it. Grace listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and the wind moving through her hair and the enormous Texas sky above her, and she thought, with a calm certainty that felt like the opposite of doubt, that this was the most clearly she had ever been asked for anything in her life, and that the answer was the easiest answer she had ever given. She said yes. They were married in October. The wedding was a small affair by the standards of the East, but large by the standards of redemption, where small populations make every gathering significant. Mrs. Hollies organized the food. Henderson's wife, a small, energetic woman named Cecilia who Grace had come to know over the summer, contributed an extraordinary apple cake that made the rounds 3 times before it was gone. Polk and Seents were there, with their families, and several of the families whose children Grace was teaching, and the preacher who came through redemption every few weeks happened to be in town, which Henderson regarded as a small miracle, and which Grace regarded as good timing. The ceremony was held in the church, which had been cleaned and decorated with autumn wildflowers and dried grasses, by a committee of women who threw themselves into the task with the enthusiasm of people who have been waiting for a good wedding. Grace wore a blue dress that she had made herself in the evenings over the previous month, a deep blue the color of the October sky at mid-morning, and she carried a small bunch of the last wildflowers of the season gathered from the creek bottom below the ranch. Tobias stood at the front of the church in a suit that fit him well and that he had clearly been uncomfortable acquiring, but had acquired anyway with the same quiet determination with which he did things. He did not entirely want to do, but had decided were worth doing. When she came up the aisle, he looked at her with an expression that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, because it was the look of a man who has been given something he had stopped believing he deserved, and is still adjusting to the fact of it. The preacher performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and appropriate brevity. And when it was done, and they had said the words and stood in the October light of the church doorway, receiving the handshakes and embraces of their neighbors, Grace felt something settle into place inside her, with the rightness of a thing long imagined finally made real. They went home to the ranch that evening, and it was home now, fully and without qualification. The gray-brown lumber house with the windmill turning in the dusk light, the horses in the corral who had come to know her as well as they knew Tobias, the kitchen where the coffee pot was always on, and the fireplace in the main room where the rocking chair that had been Nora's still stood near the window. She sat in that rocking chair that first evening, their first evening as husband and wife, while Tobias built up the fire against the autumn chill, and she looked out the window at the last light fading over the Texas grass and thought about Nora Conroy, about that folded and refolded letter, about the promise made in a charity hospital ward in Cincinnati in March of a year that now felt like a previous life. She said to Tobias, who had come to stand behind her with his hands resting on her shoulders, "I think she knew." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I think your mother knew more than she told me. I think she sent me here knowing that you would be someone I could love and that I might be someone you could love. I don't think it was only about making sure you were all right. I think she was giving you something." There was a long pause. Then he said quietly, "That would be very like her." She reached up and covered his hand with her own, and they stayed like that in the firelight while the Texas night settled in around the ranch. The months that followed were the happiest Grace had ever known. This was not a naive or uncomplicated happiness. The ranch required work, constant and demanding, and the Texas Panhandle was not a forgiving environment. The winters could be brutal and the dry spells dangerous, and the market for cattle was unpredictable in ways that required constant vigilance and management. There were hard days, days when the weather did something cruel and the work piled up, and the finances were tighter than comfort, days when Grace missed Cincinnati and her friends there, and the particular ease of a life that had not required her to adapt to everything at once. But there was also the extraordinary quality of the life itself, the space of it, the openness. The way the days had a structure and a purpose that she found deeply satisfying, the school in the morning, the ranch work in the afternoon and evening, the conversations at night that ranged across everything from the practical management of the property, to books, to the lives of their students, to the nature of the world as they each understood it. The way Tobias's company was consistently sustaining rather than depleting, the way he saw her, as Nora had predicted, with a clarity and a consistency that made her feel known. She wrote to her aunt regularly, long letters full of detail, the kind of letters designed to bring a distant place close. Her aunt wrote back with gradual warmth, moving from worried to cautiously approving to, eventually, genuinely pleased in a way that Grace recognized as the best that her aunt could offer and was grateful for. By spring, her aunt had agreed to come visit, which was a significant concession from a woman who had expressed strong views about the West being no place for a sensible person. The news that Grace was expecting their first child came in February of 1883, about 4 months after the wedding. She told Tobias in the evening while they were washing up after dinner, because the news had come clearly and completely to her that afternoon, and she saw no reason to manage it dramatically when plainness had served them well so far. She simply said, standing at the kitchen basin, "I think we're going to have a child. Sometime in the fall, I think." He was very still for a moment, and then he set down what he had been holding and turned to her, and the look on his face was the same one he had worn in the church doorway in October, that adjustment to an unexpected abundance, and he pulled her gently toward him and held her there in the kitchen with his chin resting on top of her head and said, very quietly, "My God." She laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh, and said, "That seems about right." They had agreed from early on that the Conroy place needed at least one more hand on a permanent basis. And in March, They hired a young man of 19 named Ezra who came out of a family that had ranched south of Redemption and who knew the work and the land and was, as Tobias said after the first week, better at it than most men twice his age. Ezra was quiet and competent and ate dinner with them some evenings, and Grace liked him and also recognized, with the schoolteacher's instinct she could never quite turn off, that he was someone who would benefit from books and encouraged him accordingly. Spring came to the caprock country in its particular extravagant fashion, the grass coming up green and fierce, the wildflowers arriving in waves, the sky cycling between the extremes of deep blue serenity and dramatic cloud architecture. Grace was teaching through April, when the pregnancy began to make the long days difficult, and she had trained a young woman of 20 named Dorothea, one of the older siblings of a student, who had proved to have a genuine aptitude for instruction, and who took over the school in May with Grace advising from the background. Mrs. Hollies came to the ranch for dinner every Sunday and had become something Grace would not have expected in a landlady, but had come to value enormously. A wise and funny woman who had lived enough of life to be unsentimental about it without having lost her warmth, and who loved them both with the uncomplicated affection of someone who had watched them become what they were to each other and considered it a privilege. Henderson and Cecilia came to dinner also, every couple of weeks, and Polk and his wife Alina, who had become a friend to Grace, rode over regularly, and the Saints family, Manuel and his wife Maria and their 4 children, whose youngest 2 were in Grace's school. The world of the ranch, which had been a solitary world when Grace arrived, had opened outward into a network of connection and community that was visible in the evenings when the horses were tied at the post, and the smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney, and the voices carried on the evening air across the Texas grass. Aldridge made one further attempt at the property in the spring, sending a man to the land office in Amarillo with what Hartwell caught and identified immediately as another document irregularity, this one more sophisticated than the previous attempt, but ultimately no more successful. Hartwell handled it from Amarillo with the quiet efficiency of a lawyer who has found a righteous cause and is enjoying it, and sent a letter to Grace informing her that the matter was resolved and that a formal complaint about Aldridge's conduct had been filed with the county. Grace wrote back thanking him and telling him about the baby, which was a non sequitur but felt right. Hartwell wrote back congratulating them and saying that in his experience, babies made everything better, including land disputes. Aldridge never made another attempt. Grace suspected he had concluded that the Conroy operation, with its community ties and its now documented legal standing, and its increasingly clear air of stability and permanence, was not the soft target he had originally assessed it to be, and had directed his acquisition energy elsewhere. Grace's aunt arrived in June, traveling from Cincinnati by train to Amarillo, and from Amarillo by hired buggy, wearing a traveling dress entirely unsuitable for the climate and an expression of determined adaptability that Grace found immediately and deeply touching. Her name was Harriet, and she was 62, sharp-minded, slightly formidable, and entirely unprepared for the Texas Panhandle, which greeted her arrival with a week of perfect weather that Grace suspected was the land making an effort. Harriet and Tobias assessed each other carefully over the first dinner, and reached what Grace could see was a mutual respect by the end of it, the kind that passes between 2 people who are similarly direct and similarly private, and therefore recognize in each other the signs of trustworthy character. Harriet sat in the kitchen the following morning with her coffee and looked out the window at the land for a long while and then said, "I can see why you stayed." Grace said yes. Harriet said she would have approved, and Grace understood immediately who she meant, because she had written to her aunt about Nora Conroy with a fullness and detail that had communicated more than the bare facts of the story. Harriet stayed 3 weeks, which was, she said, the longest she had been away from Cincinnati in 20 years, and when she left, she embraced Grace on the Amarillo platform with a warmth she had not always been able to express and told her to write every week, and Grace promised she would and kept the promise. The summer deepened. The ranch was in its best shape since before Tobias's father died. Ezra had proved invaluable. The cattle were doing well, and Tobias had made a deal with a buyer in Amarillo that would carry them through the year comfortably. Grace was in the full weight of the pregnancy now, the late summer heat bearing down on everything, and she moved through the days with the particular patience of a woman who has decided to trust the process and find what is interesting in it rather than simply endure it. Tobias was present in a way that she had not entirely anticipated, but that she should have, given what she knew of him. He was attentive without being hovering, practical in the ways that needed practicality and tender in the ways that needed tenderness. And he sat with her in the evenings with his hand resting on her changed shape, and talked to her about the ranch and the school and the people in town with the steady purposefulness of someone who understands that what a person needs most in a time of waiting is to be kept company. She went into labor on the 8th of October, a full year and a few weeks after their wedding, on a Thursday afternoon when the autumn light was doing its best work on the caprock grass, and the air was exactly the right temperature, clear and clean, with the smell of dried grass and the last warmth of the season in it. Mrs. Hollies had come out to the ranch 3 days earlier at Tobias's invitation, recognizing the proximity of the time, and she managed the birth with competence and calm and the assistance of Maria Seentz, who had delivered 4 children herself and knew the territory. Tobias waited on the porch with a controlled stillness that Grace, in the intervals of the labor, could see through the window, and that moved her deeply. The image of him sitting in the October dusk waiting for her, and for what was coming. Their son was born in the early evening, strong and loud in his initial announcement to the world, and Grace held him and felt the particular completeness of something that you did not know was incomplete until the missing piece arrived. She called for Tobias, and he came in and stood there looking at the child with an expression of such unguarded wonder that Mrs. Hollies had to look away for a moment with an excuse about hot water, and Grace thought her heart might simply split. They named him James Nora Conroy, taking Nora's name as the middle name in the tradition of giving family names to children. Tobias had suggested it, quietly, one evening in August, and Grace had said yes immediately, because it was right, and because Nora should be in the name of this child who was the continuation of everything she had worked for. James Nora Conroy was, from the beginning, his mother's son in curiosity and his father's son in temperament, a child who observed everything with intense interest and then engaged with it practically, and who was, as he grew through his first months into an actual personality, genuinely funny in the way of people who are funny without trying to be. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was cold but not cruel, and the ranch came through it in good order. Grace resumed teaching in the spring with Dorothea continuing as the primary instructor, and Grace teaching a more advanced class for the older students, an arrangement that suited both of them and allowed Grace to be at home in the mornings with James. They received a letter from Hartwell in Amarillo in February of 1884, informing them that the county had finalized the documentation of the Conroy water rights in a form that superseded any future challenge, the result of the formal complaint that had been filed the previous spring. Tobias read the letter at the breakfast table and handed it to Grace, and she read it, and they looked at each other over James, who was 4 months old and was attempting to eat his fist with great concentration, and Tobias said, quietly and with a smile, "My mother would have had something very dry to say about it taking this long." Grace said, "She would have said that anything worth securing takes exactly as long as it takes and complaining doesn't shorten it." Tobias said that was exactly right, and they had their coffee in the February morning light while James continued his investigation of his own hand. Spring came again, and with it the second year of their life together, which had the settled, confident quality of a life that has found its shape. The ranch was expanding again carefully, the school was thriving, and the community around them had the character of something that was genuinely growing and not just surviving. New families arriving from east and south, a real church minister who had taken up permanent residence, a doctor who had opened a small practice in Redemption, which relieved a significant anxiety about James and about future pregnancies. Ezra, now 20, had become so much a part of the operation that Tobias had offered him a genuine stake in the ranch, a portion of the calf crop each year, which was how trust was expressed in practical terms in that world, and Ezra had accepted it with the straightforward dignity of someone who recognizes when he has been genuinely valued. He had also been spending Sunday afternoons with Dorothea, which Grace had noticed with satisfaction, and had absolutely not mentioned to anyone except Mrs. Hollis, who already knew. The summer of 1884 was a good one. The cattle market was strong, the grass was sufficient, and the water stayed in the creek longer than it had in 3 years. Tobias took Grace and James out to the bluff above the dry creek on a Sunday afternoon in July, the place where he had asked her to marry him, and they sat on the same blanket in the same sun, and looked at the same view, except that now there was James between them, sitting up with great pride and pointing at things with the systematic thoroughness of a baby who intends to eventually account for everything in his visible world. Grace looked out over the miles of Texas grass and the pale sky above it and thought about the letter. The folded, soft-creased letter that was still in the drawer of the bedroom dresser, where she kept the things she wanted to keep carefully. She thought about the train through Missouri and the moment the green world fell away. She thought about Nora's hand in hers in the gray Cincinnati hospital ward and the small, consequential words of a promise made over someone who was already leaving the world. Tobias, beside her with James on his knee, said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I'm thinking about your mother." He looked at her. He said, "Me too." She said, "I want to tell him about her, when he's old enough, everything about her." The church supper and the conversations, and the way she talked about this land and about you. I want him to know her. Tobias was quiet for a moment, looking at James, who had found a pebble and was considering it with deep intellectual seriousness. He said, "She would have loved him to pieces." Grace said, "She would have told him exactly what he needed to hear, whether he wanted to hear it or not." Tobias said, "Where do you think he gets it from?" She laughed, genuinely and fully, and he laughed too, and James looked up at the sound of them laughing and laughed himself, for no reason except that the people he loved were laughing, and the sound of it rose up and went out across the Texas grass and the enormous sky and was gone. The autumn of 1884 brought 2 things of significance. The first was the news, arriving via letter from Hartwell in Amarillo, that Warren Aldridge had sold the Rocking A and was relocating to Colorado, apparently having found that the ranching business in the Texas Panhandle had become less profitable and more complicated than he had anticipated. The second was that Grace was expecting again. This time she told Tobias at the bluff, on a Sunday afternoon when they had ridden out together while Ezra watched James at the ranch. She told him simply, as she had the first time, and he held her there on the caprock with the autumn wind moving through the grass and the sky doing its particular October thing, and he said, "Are you well?" She said she was very well. He said, "Good." And then after a pause in which she could feel him thinking, he said, "I had thought once that this place might just be the 2 of us against everything, and now it keeps growing, people and connections and all of it, it keeps growing." She said, "That's what good things do." He pressed his lips to her hair and she leaned into him, and they stood there for a while with the wind and the sky and the particular piece of people who have arrived somewhere true and know it. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was harder than the previous one, with 2 storms that tested the ranch seriously. The second in January dropping enough snow that Ezra and Tobias spent 3 days on horseback moving cattle and breaking ice on the water sources, and came home those evenings cold to the bone. and Grace had hot food and hot coffee ready without making it a production, simply because that was what was needed, and she knew how to see what was needed and do it. James, now 15 months old, observed the snow with the same systematic interest he brought to everything, and added the word cold to his small vocabulary with considerable satisfaction. Mrs. Hollies, snowed in at the ranch for 4 days after the second storm, pronounced him the most impressive child she had ever encountered, which was a subjective judgment but one Grace appreciated. The school reopened in February after the storms cleared, and Grace, who had continued her involvement with the advanced class through most of the pregnancy, reduced her role gracefully as spring approached. Dorothea was now the school's de facto head teacher, competent and dedicated and visibly happy in the work, and Grace had written a lengthy recommendation letter for her to the Regional Education Board, which had resulted in a modest stipend from the county that helped considerably with her compensation. On a May evening in 1885, Grace and Tobias's second child was born. A daughter this time, coming into the world with slightly less drama than James had and considerably more apparent patience, looking around the room in the first moments with an expression of calm assessment that made Grace say immediately, "She has your eyes." Tobias, who was beside her this time, Mrs. Hollies and Maria Saints again managing the proceedings with their established competence, looked at his daughter and said, with a roughness in his voice that had nothing to do with illness, "She is extraordinary." They named her Clara Harriet Conroy, the second name for Grace's aunt, who received the letter announcing the birth, and the name with a response that Grace could see, even through the careful language of a woman not given to excessive sentiment, was something close to overwhelmed. Harriet wrote that she would come again in the summer, and that she intended to stay longer this time, and that the West seemed to agree with her more than she had expected, which was as close to enthusiasm as Harriet generally permitted herself. James, presented with his sister at the age of 19 months, approached the situation with the considered seriousness he brought to new phenomena, and after a period of assessment, reached out and very gently touched Clara's hand with one finger, and the expression that crossed his face was one that Grace filed in the permanent place in her memory, where she kept the things she did not want to lose. June of 1885 brought Harriet again, and also a letter from a former colleague of Grace's in Cincinnati, who had heard about the school in Redemption through the Education Board correspondence, and wanted to know if there might be a position for a second teacher. Grace wrote back saying there might well be, and began the correspondence that eventually brought a capable young woman named Frances to Redemption in September, allowing Dorothea and the school to accommodate the growing enrollment that reflected the town's growing population. Aldridge's land had been purchased by a family named Ockafer, which caused some initial awkward silence at Henderson's store, and was navigated in the end by the collective practicality of people who needed good neighbors more than they needed their assumptions confirmed. The Ockafors, David and his wife Amara and their 3 sons, ran a competent and honest operation, and turned out to be exactly the kind of neighbors that made the difference between a community and a collection of people in proximity. David Ockafer came to the Conroy Ranch to introduce himself in August, and Tobias welcomed him in the manner of a man who takes people at their actions rather than his prior expectations, and the two became, over the following months, the kind of neighbors who help each other without keeping count. The ranch by 1885 was everything Nora Conroy had built it to be, and then some, expanded and well-managed and embedded in a community of genuine connection and mutual support, with a good man running it who was no longer alone in the way that had frightened his mother, who had found the person who saw him and had not let her go. Grace sat one evening in September of 1885 at the kitchen table, with Clara nursing quietly and James asleep in his bed and Tobias reading across from her, and she took out Nora's letter from the drawer where it lived and read it one more time. She had read it so many times that she did not so much read it as remember it, the words simply arriving in her mind in their original sequence, the handwriting she had not seen before arriving in Cincinnati, but that she knew now as well as any hand she had ever known. The letter said, "I know you have no reason to do this, and I know I have no right to ask it. But if you can find it in yourself to go to him, to just go and make sure he is seen by someone who knows how to see people, I will be grateful for it from wherever I end up after this. His name is Tobias. He is good. He is the best thing I ever did." Grace folded the letter back into its soft creases and held it for a moment, and looked at her husband reading at the table and her daughter sleeping in her arms, and listened to the sound of her son breathing from the next room and the windmill turning outside and the Texas night settling over the caprock grass. And she thought about gratitude, about the shape of it when it is very large, when it encompasses an entire life. She said aloud to no one in particular, very softly, "You were right, Nora, he is." Tobias looked up from his book. He said, "What was that?" She smiled at him, her husband, the son of the woman who had seen her clearly in a church in Cincinnati and asked her for something that turned out to be a gift. She said, "I was just thinking about how grateful I am." He looked at her with those dark eyes, the ones that saw her the way she had come 2,000 miles to teach someone to see, and he said, with the quiet plainness that had always been his most characteristic voice, "So am I every single day." Clara made a small sound and resettled. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in the long, familiar way, and the stars over the Texas Panhandle were enormous and clear, and the lamp on the kitchen table burned steady and warm, and the house that Nora and her husband had built 30 years ago on this piece of hard and beautiful earth held its people in the way of a place that has been genuinely loved, with a solidity that was not just wood and stone, but also the accumulated weight of all the evenings and all the conversations and all the seasons of people choosing to stay. A promise had brought Grace Talmadge west. But it was love that kept her there, the kind that grows slowly and with great certainty, the kind that makes the land you stand on feel like the only land that was ever really yours, the kind that asks nothing but presence and offers everything in return. She put the letter back in the drawer gently, as if setting down a thing that had carried her a long way and could rest now. The windmill turned. The stars held their places. And in the ranch house at the edge of the caprock country, the Conroy family settled into the deep and particular quiet of the night, whole and complete and at home.